So let's talk about Uranus in the first house. And unusually, I'm going to start the conversation not by talking about Uranus in the first place, but by talking about Saturn. But I'm not going to discuss it as Saturn in any house or Saturn in any sign. Or, well, we'll see about that. But I will use Saturn as a description of the mechanism for what functional lights do, because for me it's kind of easier to explain using that. I could have used Pluto, maybe I might still, but for now let's just go with Saturn. You see, what is the functional light of Saturn? I have podcasts talking about Saturn. I've talked about Saturn in all the houses. So if you want to, if you want a more detailed form of the conversation on Saturn, you can go to listen to any of these podcasts. But in this particular one, I just want to talk about Saturn as a mechanism. Saturn is a force of retraction. And I'm not speaking figuratively, or I'm not even speaking metaphorically. My work in the 5 principles of organized complexity has demonstrated that there are 2 extra forces in nature in addition to the 4 known fundamental forces of nature. So you have the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force. The weak nuclear force is responsible for radioactivity, the type of radioactivity that keeps the sun shining. The strong nuclear force is responsible for what you call nuclear fusion or nuclear fission. Electromagnetism is responsible for all the technology that you're using today. They all run on electricity. Your phone is able to communicate with other phones based on electromagnetism. Then gravity is another fundamental force. And, we understand that one by saying, that's what keeps all the planets in orbit. That's what keeps the cosmos looking the way that it does, right? But there are 2 more fundamental forces. There is the fundamental force of the retraction force, which is what is associated with this Saturn. And then there is the blackness force. Now, if you want to know more about these forces and my work talking about these forces, I have papers which I've published on my website, on Zenodo, that you can access them through my website. And they can give you the details of what I think about these forces, because the idea of it is to work out the gauge theory of these forces, how they work, how they behave, and how they connect to all the other forces, how they manifest in nature. And the blackness force, for instance, is not your typical force that you know of, because it acts only when things begin to become very complex. That's when you begin to notice it. All right? But this is not a podcast about the blackness force. It's not even a podcast about the retraction force. It's just that the retraction force has a manifestation in the functional light of Saturn, because it retracts things, it limits them, it collapses them. All right. And that's what Saturn does. Saturn is a functional light that is a social planet in some sense. So the retraction is triggered from the social space. And in human lives, in human stories, the retraction usually occurs very early in life, while the individual is still young. And the retraction, the color of it, the flavor of it, how it works, it's connected to the sign that is generating that Saturn. And then the house condition tells you the circumstance or the context. Okay. Now, the essence of a retraction is that it is an awareness of inadequacy that is injected into your consciousness. So, for instance, you may be someone who has a Saturn in Pisces, and you love to sing. And so even while you're young, you practice singing, you just sing, but you don't really know how terrible you are until one day you sing in front of some type of social environment that contains 1 or 2 things that you imagine to be authority figures. It's not essentially an authority figure, but while you're young like that, you imagine the opinion that comes from there as a significant thing. And then you get laughed at, and you get mocked, and you get reminded that you are inadequate. And that creates a sense of shame, a sense of guilt. All right. It's a limiting force. It's something that says, look, I'm not good enough. And the individual retracts, meaning they limit themselves in that area. And so they express this limitation by not wanting to sing anymore, or not wanting to express themselves in that way anymore. They become shy and withdrawn, or sort of, Now, what is the point of this retraction? Which is why I said that it is most likely it takes place while you're young. The retraction itself is to collapse the chaos into order. Because out of the retraction comes the effect of the blackness force. Why? Because it collapses into order. So you take something that is it's not well patterned, because there's no real intelligence out of it. And then you collapse it into intelligence. That intelligence is what I describe as the blackness force. Okay? It is the thing that makes the process itself good. Without the blackness force, then the retraction of Saturn would just be pure evil. But it's not. All right. The retraction is to point you to an area that is important in your life story where you need to develop, because currently you are inadequate in that area and you need to take responsibility for the development of that area. How else will it communicate to you? That's exactly what it means. Okay. Because it knows that because it is an essential part of your life story, you can't accept the retraction. So the child who is ridiculed or who is ashamed because they sang, with a genuineness and everything, and they were rebuffed and rejected and ridiculed, they decide that they're not going to express their singing in any social space anymore. But it doesn't mean that they stop singing. They're just not going to put it out there anymore. And while the person is alone in their spare time, in their whatever, they're constantly working on everything connected to singing. Turns out that years later, when the person has developed sufficient maturity, because the way to counteract the shame is that the person now invests so much time and resources into developing that aspect of themselves. They do it away from the limelight. Often hidden, secretive in some way. They don't really talk about it. But they do it for so long that they become so good at it that how good they really are, they don't know until another social event. Some type of social environment where the acceptance is now conferred on them. And the acceptance is conferred on a higher level where recognition is conferred. Do you understand what I'm talking about? That's how it works, which is why modern astrology tells you that Saturn is where you have the potential to develop a sense of greatness or a sense of achievement or a sense of, development. The process itself is called a Capricornian journey, because where you retract, that's where the functional light of Saturn is. But that's not where you do the work per se. Where you do the work is where you have Capricorn. Do you understand? So Capricorn becomes the container or the vessel. It's a distributed light where you actually implement the anti-criticism of the retraction, because the retraction itself is like a critical event. So you can run away and go and shrink and hide and never want to come out anymore, but you cannot accept that because that aspect of your life is very important to your life story. If you don't develop it, you cannot achieve your ambitions. So the retraction force is like a vaccination to inoculate you against the thing that you're afraid of. You're afraid of failure. Okay, fail now when you're young. And you might fail even more. But ultimately, when you keep going, what you will do is that you will build out that part of your reality to such a level that it exists as a very high competence. And the time when you go from average to extraordinary, you don't even know, because you've been doing it for so long on your own, privately. And then one day when you, by some chance, you test the social space once again, you receive resounding validation. And that sets the stage for your growth. Do you understand? Now, and, you gather the potential for that. You build the compensation for that Saturnian placement. You build it where you have Capricorn. Uranus works in a similar way. All the functional lights work like that, but Uranus is not about retraction. Uranus is a functional light that is concerned with exceptional insights. And exceptional insights simply mean that the ability of your brain to override its natural tendency for logic and rationality. It is able to intuit connections that exist beyond the rational process of the mind. So Uranus basically inclines you towards extrasensory perception. That's really what it is. Now, the way that it operates is that it operates as a flash of lightning. In fact, if you look at the glyph of Uranus, in some glyphs, it really looks like a head that has an antenna on top of it, which is why most astrologers associate electromagnetism and electronic things, technology and all that. They associate it with Uranus, but that's not really what it is. It is this ability of the mind. Now, rationality gives us accuracy. Logic gives us the framework within which to frame certainty. Uranus is like a higher octave of the rational mind. So if you say that the rational mind is ruled by Mercury, then Uranus rules Aquarius. At least that's the way I see it. I don't subscribe to the idea that Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. I don't. So the way that Uranus behaves is that it sets up these trajectories of sort of like irrational thinking, but they're not irrational. They are the work of an intuitive process. And intuition is a very interesting thing because it is also done by your brain. And simply what that means is that the ability to retrieve information at lightning speed that overrides the natural tendency to be rational and yet still arrives at a conclusion that is in the ballpark of the truth. So think of A, the alphabet, the English alphabet, A to Z. Now, for someone who is following the mercurial path, you have to know A, you have to know B, C, sequentially like that until you get to Z. That's the only way you know that Z exists, is because you arrive there sequentially. For the Uranian person, they can look at a pattern that is like A, B, C, and immediately they begin to intuit in a very powerful way that because there is A, B, C, there must be X, Y, Z. Now, they have no proof for this. It just comes out of the blue. So it forms like something like a flash. All right? And more often than not, they are correct. That's what the Uranian flash is. But often in real life, most Uranian flashes don't make any sense when they are immediately received. Why? Because, if you look at one of the symbolisms for Uranus, it's like a lightning flash. It's there one instant and it's gone the other. All you are left with are the reverberations. So the Uranian insights are so powerful that even though you don't know exactly what they mean, they are enough to change your direction of activity or to alter it or to modify it, which is why Uranus in the first house tends to lead to people who some others consider to be eccentric. And that's because in the first house, Uranus is the lightning pattern, the intuitive leap. It's within the structure of the identity and personality that the person is trying to bring out. So it's a story about themselves that exists on a level that may not have even happened. And yet it just connects the past, the present, the future into one type of structure that doesn't seem to make any sense. Because the individual is not availed of the entire story or the entire context. Now, why does this happen? Isn't this just confusing, or isn't this meant to throw people off course? Not really. Like I said, it has to be good. Otherwise, it won't be in your natal chart. The idea is to create a vision. That vision is the vision of Aquarius. And Aquarius cannot light up until those flashes have come in such numbers and such quantities that the vision begins to crystallize as an idea. That's really what it is. It is in this sense that Uranus and its rulership of Aquarius represents the potential for exceptional insights. And if you're a person who has significant exceptional insights, look, you're just going to stand out as some type of weirdo in some sense, because the truth is, what is the difference between genius and madness? It's context. It's acceptance. All right? Uranus is very much associated with the behavioral pattern of genius, but it's also associated with the behavioral pattern of madness, or someone who is just cuckoo. You see, because sometimes the patterns are not real. Think of a muscle that is trained to behave in a certain way, like a reflex in some sense. So sometimes the reflex occurs when it's stimulated, even though there's no reason for it. Like if a doctor wants to test your reflex, they're going to bang you on the kneecap with something. All right? Now, you don't want the doctor to bang you on the kneecap. So the idea is that Uranus can sometimes connect to patterns that don't exist, which is where all the conspiracy theories come from. Now, of course, the time itself and things that are revealed is what determines whether a person is a full-blown conspiracy theorist or if they actually had something there. But generally speaking, Uranians are, because of this ability to connect these types of patterns like they do with intuitive flashes, it is very, very, very easy for them to fall into narratives that have unrealistic expectation values, because most of their perception is future-oriented. And every time that happens, where the person packs the aspect of themselves that is behaving this way is in Aquarius. So obviously there's a relationship with where you have Uranus in your natal chart and where you have Aquarius. Just like there's a relationship with where you have Saturn and where you have Capricorn. Okay, that's what synthesis is all about, is reading everything as a set of interconnected, holistic relationships and knowing what they mean. Because the aim of the Aquarian is the development of a vision, and the vision is always future-oriented, but the vision is always concerned about one thing, primarily above all else. And in order to draw your attention to that thing, I'm going to use an example. What sits on Staten Island in New York when you're coming from the sea and you're approaching the harbor? What do you see? I mean, it's a famous American symbol, right? It's the so-called Statue of Liberty. What is the Statue of Liberty? It's a copper statue, a statue made with copper, right? What is symbolic really about it is that this is a symbol that it's like a lady. She's wearing a tunic of some kind and she's holding in one hand maybe a set of books or journals or whatever it is. And then she's holding a torch, and she's holding it in a way that it's supposed to extend beyond her so that it can illuminate far and wide. That is not a Statue of Liberty. I don't know why people call it that, because at what point do you see the liberty? I mean, she has symbolic chains on her leg that are broken. So basically, you can see that she was once tied, or she was once chained up, but now she's free. And she's holding this torch. And torch is basically an illumination. Well, that's it, isn't it? It's a symbol for illumination, enlightenment. And so what you're looking at is meant to be the symbolic representation of a light bringer. And what is the light bringer? It's not a title, it's a function. All right? And if you've been paying attention to the Torah, for instance, they are called Noahs, the people who bring the light, because they receive exceptional insights. That's really what it is. All right? And they begin to frame the vision from the reception of the exceptional insights. You know what they used to call exceptional insights that sometimes become visions? They used to call them prophecies. They're not magic. It's a function of your brain. Every human brain, in some sense, depending on the quality of how Uranus is sitting, in respect to where Aquarius is sitting, etc. All right? So people have more or less developed abilities here and there. It's just that everyone's been taught that these things don't exist, but they do. They absolutely do. I mean, if you understand what your brain is and what you are as a human being, you will absolutely understand that they do. They complete you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be complete. So Uranus in the first house means that a person receives these exceptional insights, pouring into the nature of the identity. Because once you have Uranus in the first house, there's a question about your identity. You want to know why you are so special or why you are very different. Because very early, your extrasensory perceptive ability will be very, it will be obvious to you. And you can't really explain it to anyone else, because the zigzag that is taking place in the way that you are determining the nature of yourself is not something that you even understand, not to talk of explaining it to somebody else. So from the perspective of the ones who are watching you, they only see an eccentric personality or a crazy person, a person who acts without rhyme or reason, so to speak. But that is not what is going on. The person is, depending on the placement of Uranus, the person has been inundated with exceptional insights, some of which are just pure rubbish, so to speak, because they are so far ahead of their time, or they're so muddled up, the individual doesn't even know what is going on. And yet each and every one of these insights and flashes is enough to alter the person's trajectory. You see, as in, you could be having a day and then you have a sudden realization of a flash, and that alters your plan for the day. Okay? So Uranus transits basically mean that there's this aspect of your mind now becomes more obvious, like a doorway or a gateway that becomes more open, which is why I made a podcast regarding Pluto in Aquarius that, look, Pluto's entry into Aquarius means that the vision of Aquarius now has this Pluto in it. You understand? Pluto is where you suppress all the stories you build around your sexuality. All right? So because it's suppressed, it creates a kind of prison, underground prison for it, because it's buried and it doesn't like to be there. It hates that subterranean environment because everybody else is playing out in the sun. Why should it be underneath? It's because it's very powerful, because it's very sexual. Okay. Now, Uranus in the first house is also very curious about the nature of the way things are launched, the way things begin, They're very curious about electricity in some sense. They feel it as a sense of animation because electricity is something that they know in some sense. All right. So it's how Uranus operates in the spontaneity of the Martian environment. So they are very prone to acting in ways that may be considered very reckless if there are no other dampening factors in the chart. Okay? But the energy of recklessness, what I'm calling recklessness, is to assume that this fizz or this buzz, once it's created, it's meant for something else. That is why natal chart synthesis is very, very important. Nothing is created in your natal chart as an accident or some useless product. No, it's meant for somewhere else. If you don't know how the channel works, or if you cannot perceive the channel, or if it doesn't flow naturally because there's a bigger story taking place, then this will appear as some type of craziness in some sense. An individual who is so unstable, their narratives are so flaky, they're all over the place, no one can really trust them because they're unreliable, and they're quick to argument, very quick temperament. Okay? But the fizz itself is meant for something. And usually when Uranus is in the first house, it means that Aquarius is going to be receiving very energetic impulses of exceptional insights and visions. It's more likely to be haphazard and scattered than when Uranus is anywhere else because of the impulsivity of the Martian function attached to the first house. So in the real sense of the word, you are looking at the mindset or the makeup of a revolutionary. Someone who drastically just brings a sudden change that comes about as a sudden vision in some sense. Very, very, very important. But the person also displays exceptional intuitive capacity. They can look into the self and extract flashes of insight that would stun even the most competent psychologist. And this person is probably not a psychologist, you see. So they carry that shock factor, the ability to just wow a situation without even knowing, without even trying too hard. They are that exceptional or that eccentric in some sense. So if you have Uranus in the first house, you have been given the task of populating the vision of Aquarius, because that vision, because it's a vision of some enlightened state, it is a statement of freedom. That's why people call that, the Statue of Liberty. It's not liberty, it's knowledge, because that is the condition of freedom. Ignorance is a bondage state. Knowledge is freedom. Enlightenment is freedom, because in order to qualify as knowledge and enlightenment, it must be true. And once a human being ingests beautiful truths, it is the quality of freedom. How do you know what freedom is? It's because you are willing to let others be free. That's what it is. And in that type of environment, knowledge is free to express and flourish. The opposite is a repressive environment where the whole place is overrun with imbeciles. And all you need is one imbecile entrenched in power. And it all goes down. That's really what it is. Some Uranians in the first house they're very fascinated with launch vehicles, so rockets and things like that, things that launch things. All right. Now, it may be also very difficult for the Uranus in the first house person to remain sane in the conventional sense of the word. The force with which the Uranian insights erupt into their consciousness, it can be difficult to turn off. And so they're always reacting to this. And so to understand their behavior, you need to understand where Aquarius is sitting, because all the insights are there to populate the vision that Aquarius will eventually deliver. And the vision of Aquarius is futuristic. It's freedom based on enlightenment. And you know when it begins to crystallize because you are willing to let others be free as you want yourself to be free. It's only an enlightened state of awareness that allows you to do that. If you don't know enough, or if your knowledge is very limited, then you don't trust others with their own freedom because you don't trust yourself with your own freedom. You know, that's why the United States always amazes me, because this is an entity that tries to do two things that are mutually exclusive. All right. It wants to be a beacon of knowledge and freedom. At the same time, it operates a system that iteratively reduces the amount of freedom. I mean, someone talked to me about freedom in the US, and I told the person that the United States is dominated by corporations, businesses, and some of these are the largest businesses in the world. When was the last time you voted your CEO into office? Without that CEO, there's probably no job. Without that job, there's no paycheck for you. So how free are you really? So that's a different matter, because it ties into something else that is connected with disagreements, in representation, because you cannot represent yourself as a receptacle for the light bringer. You see, the light bringer is Prometheus in that sense. That's the myth. But he has other names. In the Torah, it's just called a Noah. So there are many types of Noahs. You have the first Noah that appeared in Genesis chapter 6. And then you have other Noahs, like Yosef was a Noah. Moses was a Noah. And you have maybe what's his name? There are many Noahs. The entire narrative of the Torah really revolves around knowledge. Uranus in the first house predisposes a person to exceptional pattern matching abilities. So if they don't find the right patterns to match, they're just going to make one up. They're going to see patterns where patterns don't exist. That's where your conspiracy theories are born. Now, it's not like people with Uranus in the first house are more prone to conspiracy theories, because that's not true. What it is that Uranus in the first house is a generator of what is supposed to be exceptional insights. But you need to learn, you need to study, you need to feed that ability with material, raw material. But in the absence of this, well, it's going to connect whatever patterns it can find from whatever type of understanding it can find. And so you find a lot of Uranus in the first house people, they may come off as easily misunderstood. Nobody seems to be able to get what they're talking about, And they are burdened by a simple question. It is simple, but it's a single question that is very pressing. Because the first house has to do with the story you are telling yourself about who you are, your motives, all right? Now, the aim of the life story is that at some point in the life story, you want to be able to showcase that motive for the world to see. A way of saying, I am here. or I was here. Now, functional lights in your first house, they are telling you that these conditionalities are set in the first house because they're very primary. They will condition the outflow of manifestation in all the other houses going forward. So Uranus in the first house is really in everything as you grow up. It's with you when you're born, and you carry it all the way to the end. That's really what it is, because it's in the first house. It's very primary. Okay, so it's a motive of some kind. So you will try to implement the motive where you have Aquarius and within the context of what you have in the 11th house. That is synthesis. All right. So the vision of Aquarius is that of a person that can bring a new innovative outlook to the underlying meaning of the house position. So that's the way it works, because Aquarius is definitely sitting on some type of house position. So it's bringing a vision to that area. And the vision itself is going to include the context of the house. Okay. The higher up the house where you find Aquarius, the more comfortable it is to express it, because Aquarius is an 11th-dimensional sign. It's the 11th sign. So it's not a personal sign. It is very rich in structure, and in some sense, it is the richest possible structure you can get until you begin to approach infinite complexity. So people who have Uranus in the first house, their minds or their sense of being is suited for complex environments. So that is why it is very good when if you have a child with Uranus in the first house, you have to understand that what you are watching is not eccentricity. It's just the potential for brilliance. All right? You need to feed it. It will become what it's going to become, but if you don't give it the right material, it's going to draw up conspiracies and different things, because the Aquarian, because it's carrying a vision of the future, it's a natural rebel. It's freedom. It wants it under any means possible. It's not willing to really negotiate, because Aquarius because it sits opposite Leo. It carries the ego of Leo just within the social environment. What it wants to do is that it is looking for its peer group. People that are clever like it, people that are insightful like it. All right. And then it wants to go into a group with them. Then it wants to shine within the context of that group, because accolades from that group mean more to it than accolades from anywhere else. That's really what it is.